Across the temples of Southeast Asia right now, countless voices are chanting in perfect unison. They are reciting the Tripitaka, the foundational texts of Theravada Buddhism, using an ancient language known as Pali. If you ask a monk in Sri Lanka or read a standard history textbook, the story of this script is presented as an unbroken, sacred chain. The Orthodox tradition states that Pali is simply another name for Magadhi, the exact regional dialect spoken by Siddhartha Gautama in the 5th century BCE. We are told these are his literal, unfiltered words, a direct transmission perfectly memorized by a dedicated monastic lineage whose sole purpose was to protect the purity of the Dhamma from the inevitable decay of time. It is a beautiful and powerful narrative of absolute fidelity. But when we treat this not just as a matter of faith, but as a historical claim, a profound fracture begins to appear. When historical linguists apply modern forensic mapping to the ancient languages of the Indian subcontinent, they expect to find a clear homeland. They look for the geographic epicenter where a specific dialect lived, evolved, and was spoken by everyday people in the markets and the fields. But when they attempt to map the Pali language, the compass spins wildly. Pali lacks a true geographic home. It does not perfectly align with the Eastern Magadhi dialect native to the Buddha's actual homeland. Instead, it presents a baffling linguistic anomaly. Pali contains complex grammatical structures, verb forms, and vocabulary that belong to several different geographically isolated regions of ancient India. The evidence quietly but firmly suggests that Pali was not the raw, everyday vernacular of the historical Buddha. It possesses a highly polished, almost engineered quality that defies the natural, messy evolution of a localized spoken dialect. This is not an accusation against the Buddhist tradition, but it is a profound historical mystery that demands an answer. If the Buddha did not speak Pali as we know it today, whose language is it? Why was a composite script chosen to carry the most sacred teachings of an entire civilization? To find the answer, we have to look past the palm leaf manuscripts and examine the oldest physical evidence written in stone. We have to dig into the linguistic archaeology of a phantom language and see what the earth actually reveals. To understand what language actually sounded like in ancient India, we have to look at the stones, specifically the rock edicts carved by Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. These massive pillars, scattered across the subcontinent, are the oldest decipherable physical texts we possess. Ashoka had them carved in the local dialects of each specific region, giving us a perfect linguistic snapshot of the ancient world. When we compare the Pali texts to these inscriptions, the results are startling. The Buddha lived and taught in the eastern region of Magadha, but Pali does not match the eastern Ashokan edicts. There is a specific phonetic footprint. In true Eastern Magadhi, the R sound is replaced by an L. The ancient word for king, Raja, becomes Laja, but in Pali, the R is strictly retained. Linguistically, Pali is a much closer match to the edicts found far to the west, near modern Gujarat. The mainstream historical view, championed by early scholars like Wilhelm Geiger, argues that Pali was simply a lingua franca. As Buddhism expanded westward along ancient trade routes toward Ujjain, monks needed a language understood across different kingdoms. In this view, Pali evolved naturally as a hybrid trade dialect, absorbing regional words over generations, until it became the standard language of the monastic elite. But there is an alternative reading of the evidence, pointing to something far more deliberate. Some philologists argue a language this uniform does not evolve by accident on a trade route. They look to the 1st century BCE in Sri Lanka, at the Aluvihari rock temple. This is where the Tripitaka was finally committed to palm leaves after a devastating famine threatened the monks who held the oral tradition. This alternative theory suggests Pali was artificially engineered in that very moment. Realizing the vulnerability of memory, monastic scholars didn't just write down a local vernacular. They systematically synthesized older regional dialects to construct a standardized, timeless language, a linguistic vault designed to lock the Dhamma into a permanent, unchangeable form. The evidence leaves us staring at a masterpiece, one of either organic evolution or brilliant, coordinated invention. We are left chasing a linguistic ghost. What the historical and archaeological evidence clarifies is that Pali is a highly refined composite, not the raw, everyday vernacular of the Buddha. But the exact moment and location of its creation remains buried beneath centuries of silent history. We simply do not have a single smoking gun text that marks the birth of this sacred script. The hard evidence stops at the edge of antiquity, leaving the ultimate origin unresolved. But this raises a much larger point about how we understand religious history. For those who grew up immersed in the Buddhist cultures of Southeast Asia, these syllables are sacred. When you spend your life hearing monks chant in Pali, there is a profound comfort in believing you are hearing the precise acoustic echo of the historical Buddha. When the historical ground shifts beneath that belief, it can be deeply unsettling. Yet recognizing Pali as a potentially engineered language doesn't invalidate the texts. Instead, it reveals something almost more miraculous, an astonishing, coordinated intellectual effort by early monastics. They built a linguistic vessel capable of carrying incredibly complex philosophy across centuries, borders, and warring kingdoms without the original meaning degrading. We finally understand the vehicle, but the brilliant engineers who built it remain entirely in the shadows. If these early scholars possessed the linguistic mastery to synthesize a timeless language, what else did they refine when they finally carved the oral tradition into palm leaves? How much of the canon is the direct voice of Siddhartha Gautama, and how much reflects the brilliant minds of the unseen architects who saved his words from the famine of time? This investigation continues. If you want to keep following the evidence with us, the Buddhist Enigma is where we ask the questions that deserve more than easy answers. The next time you hear a monk chanting in the temple, ask yourself whose voice you are actually hearing.